Hey everybody, welcome to our YouTube video. I'm Brad Scow with ConnectWise here with Nate Austin with MyTech and Steve Riot with Next Tech, and we are here to talk different sales topics from time to time. And today we're going to talk through what gets measured, gets managed, and there's a lot to this. We're going to break it into a couple of parts. But welcome Nate, welcome Steve. Good to be with you guys again, talking sales.
Always fun.
Awesome.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. So we had a bit of a conversation because both well let's start here. Nate, how big is the sales organization that your company manages right now?
There's 12 people, 12, 13 people in our sales team today.
Yep. And Steve, how big is yours?
Yeah, right at 30.
Okay. So these are relative to a lot of the MSPs, TSPs that we work with and are a part of the community, fairly mature sales organizations. Like they're big enough where you got clearly defined roles and managers that are in place and some development efforts. But you guys both go back to the day where you had none of that, right? Like where you were just getting started. And what we were talking through as we were preparing for this was, what is that journey like of almost like out of necessity, trying to put some measurements in place in management? And I think what we landed on was most of us put in a tool like ConnectWise, or what was back in the day, it was called ConnectWise, like a PSA tool to manage your service team, right? Manage your service tickets. And you realized at some point that, hey, there's some things we could do with sales, right? Because it's owner-led sales, and you get to the point where when you're just starting out, you got to make sure that you're generating the revenue that you need, right? So what was that, Steve? I'll start with you. Like what was it like to go from like nothing or a spreadsheet into just having a consistent tool in place to be able to track some of this stuff?
Brad, I just came up with this, so I'm going to shock both of you with some new information. But this reminds me of my first car, which happened to be a truck, right? Like my initial goal was to get to school, right? Like I was happy that it got me to school. And quite frankly, that's like what we started with in the sales engine, right? We put in this new tool of ConnectWise, and we were happy to see what salespeople sort of kind of might be doing, right? It got us on the board. And Brad, I know that you will take my my recommendation, but think about it this way, right? Like as soon as I became reliable to get to and from school, meaning I'd fixed the radiator leak and, made sure the thing had tires that had a little bit of tread and there was air in them and stuff like that, then I wanted a radio, right? They didn't come with a radio, but I wanted a radio, so I went out and I spent some money and I installed this radio. Spent all my time putting 2 new speakers because I'm in high school. I want to be cool and loud, and then realized I didn't put gas in the tank, and the basic need wasn't met anymore because I couldn't get to school. So I had to start over, right? Like sell a speaker so I could afford gas. To get to school, right? And so that's kind of what it reminded me of is the journey here has been like the original goal was just to get there, and now I want a really cool shiny car that has 4-wheel drive and like an awesome Bose stereo and satellite navigation, all that stuff. So I look at that as that's our journey, but I think depending on where you're at in that journey and depending on what you're looking for, like basic transportation still is at my list of needs, and if I exceed that, then I might have a problem.
Yeah, right. If I Nate, I'll come to you in a second, but if I continue your analogy, there were probably times when there were really cool things you wanted in your car that you put in your car, and then you realize, like, yeah, I didn't need that. Like that wasn't part of what I need long term, right? But you spent the time, you did the research, you invested in it, you like put it in your car, and then I'm not using that.
And then take it a step further, and this is a true story. Like a year into the journey, I hit a deer, and I had to start over, right? Because I had to like repair the radiator and get the bumper back on and make it drivable, so my dad would let me get a new truck, right? So, anyway, sorry. I apologize for jumping down on both of you.
Yeah. Nate, do you have?
I hit a deer too.
On to that, yeah.
Yeah. what it makes it's funny. I always appreciate the randomness of some of the directions we go, but like what it made me think of is so Steve's organization is like a bunch of used car salespeople. That's what I just heard. I don't know. No, that's not it at all.
Wow.
No, I'm
All right.
just teasing. But
Yeah.
but no, I think of that. That's sometimes how we one of the things we try and do is that most people, even our technical people, this is a whole nother conversation for another day, but like how most people have bad experiences with salespeople. And so trying to like differentiate ourselves, even internally, is one of those things. But that again, like as I digress. But to go back to your point, Brad, is it really is, there's so many things that we had to choose as a business. Like the biggest problem we had when we started with ConnectWise was just we needed to track our service tickets. Like you mentioned, we didn't care about sales. We weren't good at it. We were just trying to get any revenue we could. And I remember when we first started putting some data into the CRM side of ConnectWise, it was we were just trying to track the quotes that we had put out there. And I can't remember exactly because this was like late 2000s. I don't think we were using any quoting tools. It was just manually adding revenue data into the opportunity at the time. And we were just trying to track that. And it was also after, interestingly enough, there's Arlen through the peer groups had done a SWOT on our organization. And I remember him telling us something like, hey, dummies, there's 4 owners at MyTech at the time. It doesn't take 4 people to run a company your size. So, do your job. Pick one person to lead the company and the rest of you do your job. So part of the catalyst for us, and I think there's a lot of owners who find themselves in this position that you're distracted with a lot of the different things that you may be having to do as an owner running the company. And so we had to say, look, focus. Part of your role, and it ended up being like 90+% of my role at the time, but even if it's only 50% of your role, or 25% of your role, part of your role is sales, if that ends up the case. And so what does that mean? And what does that look like? And how do you track it? And so we just started with revenue. And I'll tell you one last story on that, and it's really quick. And then I remember like the lesson that really made me realize that, you don't make money on revenue, you make money on margin, is that I remember getting a referral from a colleague here in town because they didn't have the partnership with HP or something like that, and I believe it was an HP SAN that I sold, and it was like a $75,000 SAN, and I was pumped to sell a $75,000 SAN, and I think we made $1,000 on it. So here I was all excited about selling $75,000 of revenue. But we only made $1,000 because I didn't know anything at the time. And, that was a great example of when that's the thing that sticks in my head the most, of where we started with just looking at the revenue, trying to hit a revenue number. And I was so excited because I blew out my revenue number, but I didn't make any money.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Nate,
people, that's where we started, Brad.
For people that have been in the business less than 10 years, what in the world's a SAN?
I'm going to let you look up that acronym if you're looking for an answer to that question.
Don't they make discs, sand discs? Isn't that what we're talking about?
I think.
Yeah. And
yeah.
We digress.
Yeah.
So I'm going to transition to that. Kind of one of the key points we want to get across, which is, your management should come, like, don't do management for management's sake. Like just because you hear somebody measuring and managing something doesn't mean you should, because there's probably lots of things that Nate and Steve measure with the sales teams their size, that if you're just getting started, or if you have a couple people, you're not going to measure and manage things at the level that Nate and Steve are. But before we get to that thing, I want to spend just a couple minutes and talk about, before you can even start measuring and managing, you have to get a discipline in place where you actually have the good data and consistent tracking of it to be able to measure and manage that sort of thing. And so I don't want to go too far down this rabbit trail, but I want each of your advice on, like, how do you get, service people are they're one kind of beast to try to get to put data in, but a salesperson entering data, talk us through a little bit of guidance or advice on what do you do to make sure that they're putting in what you need to get in. And Nate, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah. So one of the things that I love the way you asked that question, Brad. And again, I would start with being clear about the problem you're trying to solve and what data you really need, so that you're not, because one of the things that salespeople will hate to do is busy work.
Yeah.
If it's just perceived as busy work, like you're just making me do this to do it versus some value to the organization or value to me as an individual. So try not to, and it's really easy to go there because there's so many things you can do.
Right.
Defining what you should do and what's
Yeah.
important to you and what's valuable to you is really important to start there.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite tactics to use, other than just trying to make sure that we are clear about the thing that we're asking our salesperson to do from a data entry perspective is valuable to them, that's really important, is that ask a salesperson this question. Hey, if you have a complaint from a client and you try to go look at the ticket and there's no notes from a service person, are you okay with that? Because the salespeople are going to be the first ones who poke at a service person not putting notes in a ticket if it applies to them trying to deal with a problem that their client has. And so the same logic applies to them. They need to be sure to put notes in their activities and opportunities and or tickets if they're using tickets to hand off to service. The same logic applies. That's part of their job, is to make sure those notes are captured so that we can go back and actually, CYA if that's what you're trying to do, or at least remember what the conversation or what follow-up you're supposed to do.
Yep. Yeah. Steve, what comes to mind for you in the challenge of getting information into the system in a consistent way?
Well, yeah, that is a common issue. And so what do the excuses look like that come in? It's, well, I'm not paid to do that is one I've heard, right? So I should be paid to enter my opportunities or activities into the system, of which my answer is, as far as I'm aware, you're going to get a paycheck on Friday. So if you want that paycheck, you will enter the data to get your paycheck. So therefore, you are paid to enter this data. You will not be paid to not enter the data, right? Like, so you got to address those. But then to your point of like, why does it matter? I think Nate gave some great examples of that, but also look, if we're not proactively making sure the service engine's able to deliver what you're selling, you're going to have a problem, right? Well, I've got to know what you're selling to be able to prep them for the delivery. The way that we do that is by having that information in the dashboard. But again, I go back to these excuses, if you will, of it's busy work. Nate called that out quite a bit. It takes too much time, or I'm going to put it in Excel because it's faster, right? Something like that. And I think this is a little bit of that boss versus leader moment for me, where it's like, look, if you want to work here, this is the minimum expectation of working here. Much like reporting time for a technician, if you don't report to time, you don't get paid. Not do that. So let's be clear. I was like, well, you're probably right. Or, oh, you met your quota, you're killing it. So this time is, it's a consistent message. Every time, everybody, me included, do it this way.
Yeah. So,
and if I may, Brad, jump on that, really, just two things you mentioned, Steve, that I think are really important, and it depends on where you are on your journey, but one of the things that we do, and I think is a pretty consistent thing to do as you mature as a sales organization, is have a caveat like asterisks on your comp plans that say, this is pending following our processes and procedures and documentation, right? So and again, I'm really not trying to withhold pay from a salesperson. I think that's a really bad idea. But like, if you have a salesperson that's not following your process and procedures, they need to know that that's part of their job, to Steve's point of like, that's how you get paid. Part of your job and part of why you get paid is because you're doing this entering and following our systems. And the second part is really probably one of the biggest lessons I ever learned from sales management, probably one of the biggest mistakes I made, was it's also my job as a sales manager to check in every week in my weekly one-on-one. Are they entering the data that I'm expecting them to enter? And when they get used to your team, and sometimes you have to hold yourself accountable to this if you're the owner-led sales doing this, right? And so but if the team gets used to knowing that the first thing that we do every time we go our one-on-ones is I'm expecting your data to be entered, and if it's not, guess what we're doing in our one-on-one? Instead of having valuable conversations in our one-on-one, I'm going to sit there and look over your shoulder and watch you enter your data. That's what I'm going to do. And I make that pain point so that they know to prepare to come into my one-on-one so that data is good. So, and that, I think that you can start simple with that at the beginning, but as you grow and build your team over time, it still is applicable.
Yeah. All right. So let's transition a little bit into like what gets measured. And we talked about, Nate, you said usually the the starting point of getting data in, and you're not even really measuring, but it's just central data collection, is to make sure things aren't falling through the cracks, right? Like more opportunities maybe that you can remember, especially the little ones. You're like, dang it, I forgot about that. So you have a system where you start to track some of those things. But that's not really measuring and managing. Where measuring and managing come in is, and there's usually a progression. To your point, Nate, when you start out, usually it's revenue. Like we need to measure, are we generating enough revenue? And then eventually you learn, well, we got to generate revenue, but where we make money is off of enough gross margin, right? So then you begin to measure gross margin, which then kind of leads to, okay, if we're not making enough gross margin, or we really want to track gross margin, we got to start tracking opportunities and what goes into an opportunity. And then if you're not getting enough opportunities, or you build a sales staff, eventually you get to the point where you're measuring like their activities that would lead to opportunities progressing, right? Like it's kind of there's like a progression, there's a maturity that you go through. And what you don't want to do, to your point, Steve, about you don't want to burden people with busy work that you're not gonna really do. Like there's no need to start tracking activities if you're still robust enough where you're generating the revenue and the gross margin that you need to provide a good, healthy margin, right? Because like if you got 2 or 3 salespeople and everything's working, like you can just sort of by osmosis know that you're doing well, right? But eventually you have to get to the point where you get more granular as you do it. So Steve, I'll come to you. Like talk about that progression. Talk about like what goes into beyond just kind of the idea of like we need to measure opportunities. And what I'm thinking of, just to set you up, is like you have to define some things. You have to like kind of like vet what that behaviors look like, define what good looks like. Talk about how you matured through some of those things as you progressed.
Well, yeah, we've referred to it in a general term of putting opportunities into your CRM, right? Well, what's an opportunity? What's an activity? Defining what those things actually mean. And I'm going to take a little sidestep here, Brad, is I remember, like, you talk about the pain of what you measure, but I remember a sales rep that was radically successful, and then he got into a slump. And it was kind of a weird slump because he was too busy, yet he couldn't make quota. And you're like, what is going on here? And meanwhile, he's getting calls about complaints about him from customers going, he's not responding to me. And you're like, okay, that feels like too much opportunity, yet we can't make the quota. So we start diving into what's going on. And what we ended up measuring with him in particular was number of emails in his inbox, as silly as that is. But we correlated the fact that he had, like, when I started that, it was like 22,000 messages in his inbox. Well, no wonder people weren't getting return calls. Who knew what was in that box, right? Yeah. And we started measuring like this really, really basic thing of going, what's your inbox look like today? And it correlated directly to his customer satisfaction, to his turnaround on his quotes, and ultimately to revenue.
Yeah.
So it's not always the same thing. So where was the pain point that you're trying to solve as an organization? And I've heard this in many startup organizations say, well, I want to grow revenue. I want to grow revenue. I want to grow revenue. Meanwhile, they're not servicing their existing accounts. Like, are they doing the project work that needs to be done to keep them on a great managed platform? Are they scaling their customers with the technology? Like, they don't need new customers. They need to take care of the customers they have. Yeah. So the metric might be, are you performing those QBRs, quarterly business reviews? Are you touching base with your customer? Are the technicians getting you the tech leads that you should be having to grow the technology? They're not repairing, 8-year-old computers or something. And I know I took that in a weird place, Brad, so I apologize. And I'm sure Nate will clean that up for me.
Yeah, it's a great example of like necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like a person's just not being productive and you're wondering why. It doesn't make sense. So you start to measure some things, and you guys found the right thing, right? Like you sounded like there's just too much noise, not able to get to what he needed to do. But Nate, how about you unpack for us a bit, like how you progressed through those things, because I'm sure
Yeah.
what you guys looked at, like, you always kind of go back to a pivotal moment in your kind of company's history where some folks came in and did a SWOT with the four of you as owners,
Yeah.
and you took a turn, right, and you started to realize some things. I'm sure what you were measuring and managing then is a lot different than what you were now, right? Like
Yep.
what drove change, and when did you what are some of the gates or some of the processes that you went through to mature through that?
Yeah, and I'll start that off by a little bit of a story that Steve, your story reminded me of. So I remember having a conversation one time as sales manager to one of my reps, who's actually another owner at the time, who um, uh, he wasn't like he did it out of necessity, not because he was passionate about being a salesperson. But I remember having a conversation in a one-on-one. I'm looking at his pipeline. I believe it was the month of May one year, many years ago, and he had like 30 or 40 opportunities, in the month of May. And these are all like larger, not small opportunities, but a bit large and small. And I'm like, look, there's no way you are going to win 30 or 40 opportunities. That's more than one a business day. That's not going to happen. So help me understand which ones have the greatest probability, because he was also having a problem prioritizing. Help me understand which ones have the greatest probability of closing in this month versus next month versus next month, so that we can prioritize our efforts and our time and our energy towards getting those over the finish line. And the answer that he gave, which I will never forget, is like, Nate, it's like you're asking me to choose which child I love the most. That was his response, and I got a good chuckle out of that, and I still do. But the point is that sometimes, like to Steve's point, he found out the problem was email. This person was just using opportunities as a dumping ground for just some basic tracking of to-dos, but not using it as as a way to prioritize the work that they needed to do. It doesn't mean if there's something that's 3 months out that you don't start working on it now, but what are the things based on the business need of the client that's going to help you prioritize? These are the most important opportunities for me to work on now versus the ones in the future. And I think that's a good illustration of kind of where we started, right? Is like, look, we just wanted to start tracking it, like you alluded to earlier, Brad, for just making sure that stuff didn't fall through the cracks. And in fact, ConnectWise or any CRM probably has, I know ConnectWise has it, it's like they call it the get the red out thing, but other CRMs probably have something similar. But like, we didn't do that when we first started. Like we weren't using activities consistently that way. We weren't using sales tickets to pass between departments to make sure that we got solution engineering done or finance requests finished. It was all just for tracking and making sure that we didn't let things fall through the cracks. So then as we went along, that we learned, okay, we layered in a quoting tool, right? And so we started now I didn't have to manually enter this information in on my opportunity. My quoting tool dumps it in there. I just had to make sure I put out the quoting tool, right? Then we figured out our processes. It's like our project team was like, well, I'm not getting enough good information for me to execute on what you're selling. So we had to do some collaboration to define what's the process that we need to go through to make sure that we're collaborating with the solution engineering and or the professional services team to make sure that they have the right information, et cetera, and the right products. So it was really very much iterative, but it was starting with just like the basics of like, let's use it so that we don't drop the ball. Then as we got better, other problems came up, like handing it off to professional services. Well, now we need to do a better job of our process and the steps we're going to go through and the collaboration and the review we're going to do. Now we're too busy, and so now we need to figure out how to prioritize better. So now we're trying to use the pipeline a little bit better and the stage is a little bit better. So it was really just and a comment that I think we talked about earlier was, this isn't necessarily going to be, and Steve's story has alluded to that too, this isn't necessarily going to be an organizational wide problem, meaning that sometimes you might have a rep who struggles with prioritization and another rep who doesn't. And so you might have to point at different things and use the tools, teach them to use the tools to help solve the problem that they might be having in their particular level of execution.
Yeah. I love that, Nate, and taking that a step further. We have some reps, we remember every activity, every email, every phone call, every networking event. And then we have other reps that have been here a long time that are really good at, and quite frankly, keep their pipeline in the system, make sure we know what they're doing, and just keep churning the revenue and, awesome. So it is, and I don't have to treat them equally, right?
Correct.
They're at different stages in their career, and sometimes they can like that's part of the benefit of being tenured and good at your job is you don't have to do all that. But if you regress, then you have to start doing those things. You're like, wow, I
Absolutely
really don't
right.
want to do that. Great.
Yeah,
Well,
I think kind of the art of this that we're trying to land on is it's that necessity thing that like measuring and managing it's a lever to shape and achieve things or move things that need to be
Mm-hmm.
different, right, than what
Mm-hmm.
you're experiencing. And if you try to put measurements or managements in place for things that like you don't have a use for, like that's like you're killing people, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's and this stuff changes over time. It iterates. And Nate, I'm assuming as part of that iteration, while you're adding things, hopefully at the same time there's things that like, okay, we don't need to measure these things anymore, right? Like we can get rid of this.
Well, I would say it sometimes it's not so much about getting rid of it. It's just that you end up finding a tool or an integration or a system that does it for you, right? Like
Sure.
I didn't have to enter in quoting data because we got a quoting tool that imported the data in a way that
Yeah.
populated my CR, my
Right.
opportunity, right? So
Yeah.
those are the kind of things I think that can we drive out the manual entry of things by
Yeah.
using systems and tools. But yeah, you're right, Brad.
Yeah.
There's a piece of things go away as well.
Yeah. So to that point, and I'm mindful we got about 5 minutes left, right? So this is gonna be our last topic. Then we're gonna have part two of this where we're gonna get into more specifics around some financial measurements and some of the actual ones that we're using and how they work. But um, when we were planning for this webinar, we talked about again the kind of these esoteric concepts, and one of the terms we used was is the juice worth the squeeze, which means like there are times when it seems like it might make sense to measure something, but the overhead and getting that measurement put in place like doesn't justify what you're going to be able to move or change or kind of
Mm-hmm.
improve
Mm-hmm.
performance on, right? Like, so can you guys each unpack a little bit like what goes through your head when you're trying to think, is it worth measuring this? Can you unpack that a bit? Nate, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and Brad, the word that I'm remembering it now, but it seems like nearly every other time someone asks me a question like this, I forget the word, which is materiality, right?
Yeah.
Is how material is the thing that you're trying to measure relative to the scope of your business, right? If it's, and I think there's some financial definitions around that too, meaning like if it's less than 1 or 5% of something,
Right.
like is it really that important to measure?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that recently, just to apply a recent example of that, that last September 2023, we made the decision, as we're trying to get better and more of our clients are moving to Microsoft Azure services, that we used to have all of our hosts, like all our Microsoft 365 licenses and all of our Azure all on one journal line item on our P&L. And but we expect to get different margin on our 365 versus our Azure services. And so so as an organization, we wanted to track that better, and we wanted to be able to manage to that better and differently. And so it wasn't until September of 23, even though we've been selling Azure for years, it wasn't until September of 23 that we decided to say, actually going into October 23, that, hey, we're going to make a separate line item for that. So now all of our Azure services are going on this line item and our 365 are going on that line item. So they don't blend and muddy the water. So we can be very clear about what we're getting. It's going to be easier to audit and make sure that we don't get a weird bill that's skewing our margins. So it was very much this is where we're at in the maturity of our organization and the problem that we're trying to solve based on the revenue that's increasing in our business. And we wanted to be able to do a better job of having easy visibility to how we were performing. And so we made a change.
Right.
And so that's probably a recent example of where it wasn't material in the past and it became material. And so we made a change.
Yeah. Right. Steve, you got an example of materiality for you guys?
yeah, I'm going to go way back. This was when I thought I knew everything about sales management. I had this idea that I was going, I required all the sales reps to put a lead into ConnectWise as our CRM, right? A lead, meaning that they might possibly want to buy something from us, and they had to put it in ConnectWise before they made the phone call. And then, like a couple weeks later, they call me. I'm talking to my reps, and they're like, "Well, I called that company, and they're out of business." So they spent 3 minutes putting the lead into ConnectWise for somebody to go, they're out of business.
Yeah.
Well, that was completely wasted time, right? Like I was measuring something that had no value. I couldn't use in the future, and it had no future direction. So sometimes you have to adjust. I mean, sometimes I have really shitty ideas too, but I think it goes both ways.
Yeah. Okay. Lots we could talk about and unpack here, but we're going to save some of this for our next conversation. What gets measured gets managed, part 2. Super creative in our thinking and titling. And Stephanie does a great job of putting all of this kind of marketing and things together. So couple things. One, look, Nate and Steve have spent a lot of time capturing a lot of their wisdom and making some utility that you guys can use. If you go to hub.connectwise.com/growth kit, you can get some videos and you can get a lot of templates. It's all free. Just go there. You don't even have to sign up. You can just download it and you can watch the videos. All kinds of useful material there. Second thing would be, look, we're trying to grow this community and this channel. So I'll be like the YouTube people that I know, smash the subscribe button right there. Smash it, smash the subscribe button. I think that's what the kids say nowadays. Maybe I'm missing it, but that's what I'm going to roll with. But yeah, we want to grow the community. If you got any feedback, certainly put it in, get a hold of us. We want to hit topics that are useful to you. And next time we're going to drill in this, like I said, more financial metrics and what we measure and manage there and some of the specifics that, we talked theory today. We're going to get a little bit more granular on our next video. So Nate, Steve, any final words of wisdom for people listening out there?
Yes. If my company sells used cars, Nate sells the warranty.
Well, I'm glad that we have that straight because, I always appreciate Steve does a better job of bringing humor to these. But I'm excited about next time because I think there's we're going to really try and dive into the practicality, as Brad mentioned, of there are things that we've learned to measure and evolve to measure and manage that I think help really solve problems that we all face in the industry today, and that they're important. And so I'm excited about that to get it, and I'm excited to grow the community. And thanks, Brad, for facilitating, and Steve for participating, and Stephanie that none of y'all see behind the scenes helping us out, make sure this stuff keeps going. So we'll see you next time on part 2.